this thing about women in the law, folk, what's going to be significant about this? Every chapter talks about women during the time period we're talking about. Women were eventually to get more and more rights and emerge higher on the economic scale. Full equality of pay has not been achieved. And again, whether that's bad or good remains to be seen. Particularly church membership was mostly female. This has been true all the way down through Christendom. But the people in charge were always male. A few women preachers emerged. They were never ordained, but some of them were allowed to preach. The best known was Jemima Wilkinson, and the old books used to include a picture of Jemima Wilkinson. And anyway, I'll let you, if you will, look at the picture yourself and make up your own mind. She dressed like a man and caused a lot of controversy. And she did not really do justice to her gender behind the pulpit. Again, there were a lot of religious innovation, particularly fiery sermons that appealed to emotion. This was to be a part of the religion. Now, we're going to have more to say about religion before we come to the end of these 7 chapters. All right. Virginia. What you might not realize, and believe me, I did not realize this for some time, the Virginians had held the presidency for 24 years. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe were all Virginians. That's 4 of the first 5 presidents were Virginians. So except for a 4-year period when the New Englander John Adams had the presidency, Virginians held it. Now, Virginia at this time was the largest state because West Virginia at this time was part of Virginia. Now, during the Civil War, West Virginia broke away and stayed with the Union. And in the middle of the Civil War, West Virginia was admitted to the Union as a separate state, and they've remained a separate state to this day. But before West Virginia broke off from Virginia, Virginia was the biggest state east of the Mississippi. And when West Virginia broke off from Virginia, Georgia then became the biggest state east of the Mississippi and has remained so to this day. Persons heading from Michigan to Florida, and a lot of people do. Ohio, they get through pretty fast. Kentucky, pretty fast. Tennessee, yeah, fast. Get to Georgia and think we're almost there. Georgia is almost as big as Kentucky and Tennessee combined. Get in Georgia and stay in it a while. Again, biggest state in the east of the Mississippi. A lot of people, but particularly in New England, were getting tired of Virginians holding on to the country. Anyway, James Monroe, like Jefferson and Madison, served 2 terms also. His administration was known as the Era of Good Feelings. This occurred before the problems that would lead to the Civil War came up. So the rivalries and the hard feelings that were to come later that were to lead to a big, long war did not really come to the fore during James Monroe's administration. All right, now, folk, before I proceed, there is a story that it's not in your book, but I think is quite fascinating, and some of you will see it on the test. So anyway, we had 2 presidents back to back. Their names were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. They started out as friends. They sat in the Continental Congress together, and John Adams, when they asked him to write the Declaration of Independence, he turned to Jefferson. And as you may know, on July 4th, 1776, hopefully you all know that, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. Well, years went by. The 2 men were to both serve as ambassadors in Europe. They were to try to negotiate with the North African pirates with no success, but because those people could not be negotiated with except with cannonballs. But anyway, they tried to negotiate. Then they got back home, and Both of them became strong enemies. During the dirty campaign of 1800, each accused the other of things so bad that I'm not going to repeat it here. And they remained enemies during the entire time that Adams was president and Jefferson for 12 years. Then Jefferson left office and retired to his home in Monticello. By this time, John Adams had gone back up to his home in New England. Well, someone told one of them that, hey, the other one would really like to resume the friendship with you. So one of them wrote to the other one, and they started exchanging letters. We have a copy of their letters. Their letters tell us that they would speculate on like which one of them would die first. They talk about how that their aches and pains made walking difficult, and how it's really getting harder and harder just to walk to the mailbox. I don't know why Jefferson didn't have his slaves do that for him, but then they talk about politics and talk about how that a new generation of young men had risen up that they didn't even know, and men they had never heard of were now running the governments. Yet the other one say, yeah, that's got the same thing. They'd speculate on what they could expect in the afterlife. Which one of them was going to die first? Well, at a certain date, John Adams lay in his bed very sick. Now, this was 10 years before the telegraph was invented. John Adams knew that this was the end. Some of his last words were, "And Thomas Jefferson yet lives." No, he didn't know that earlier that same day, Thomas Jefferson had died. Jefferson's family wrote to the Adams family, but the letter did not get there for several days. And when Adams died, the Adams family wrote to the Jefferson family, but again, the letter did not get there for 7 days. They both died on the same day. Now here is a story that I've had more than one student say they don't believe. The date they died on was July the 4th, 1826. 50 years to the day since the Declaration of Independence was signed. Talk about a coincidence, but they both, and if you don't believe it, look it up, folk. I looked it up when I was 9 years old in my father's encyclopedia. It's there. John Adams died July 4th, 1826. Thomas Jefferson died July 4th, 1826, but Jefferson died early in the morning. Adams died late in the evening. Neither one of them knew that the other was going to pass on the same day. To me, a fascinating story. Makes you wonder sometimes about what all is going on in this that we don't know or understand. All right, Missouri. Missouri asked to join the Union in 1820. Now Missouri is right here. It was west of the Mississippi River. I'm not going to say it was the first state. I believe, though, that it was the first state to come in west of the Mississippi. Now, at this time, the number of slave states and the number of free states were equal. That meant that in the Senate, there was an equal number of slave state senators and an equal number of free state senators. In the House of Representatives, on the other hand, there were a lot more people living in the free area, so there were much more representatives in Congress and the House than there were slave representatives. Well, the South was determined to keep that number equal. The North was determined that either side would get ahead. Anyway, Missouri asked to come into the slave state. If Missouri came into the slave state, there'd be more slaves than there were free. Well, someone offered up a compromise, said, I'll tell you what, let's take Missouri into the slave state with the understanding that after a certain number of years, all those slaves will be free. That didn't work. Compromise. The northern states did not accept, the southern states probably did not accept it. The northern states thought it was a good idea. They could not agree on how many years. Would it be 10 years, 15, 20, 25 years? After a certain number of years, all the slaves were to be free, but this did not work. So Missouri had to wait. But while this was going on, way up here, Maine had decided it would not be part of Massachusetts anymore, so without a big quarrel fight, Maine simply broke away from Massachusetts. Maine had been part of Massachusetts since the beginning, and Maine asked to come into the Union as a free state. There were no slaves in Maine anyway, or at least not a significant number, but They have already had an anti-slave constitution drawn up. So a man named Henry Clay, who wound up working up 3 compromises for the country. Compromise. Hopefully you all know the meaning of that word compromise. It means that each side gives in a little. I once said to a young woman, you don't compromise your convictions, but in a democracy you sometimes just have to compromise your vote in order for there to be any kind of agreement. But anyway, they compromised. Maine came in as a free state, Missouri came in as a slave state, and I guess, suppose you might say, everybody was happy. Well, now, they also worked out another part of an agreement. They drew a line and said from now on, any state that comes in north of this line will be free, and any state that comes in south of this line will be slave. For 30 years, this agreement worked. 30 years, but then in 1850, something happened that nobody had foreseen. California out here needed to come in as a state because California had a whole lot of crime and a whole lot of lawlessness going on. So they felt like the only way to solve, they had to draw up a constitution, elect a governor, appoint judges, and then people might respect the law more if the law really had a basis. But California asked to come in as a free state. California's population was overwhelmingly anti-slave by 1850. We'll talk more about that later. But anyway, the compromise that Henry Clay worked out in 1820 was to last until 1850. All right. And for the next 30 years, the Senate was to be equally divided between slave and free. The question of slavery was to be opened again and again and again until the Civil War. Now, Jackson, well, some white settlers were being killed along the southern, particularly in South Georgia. And Jackson got up an army, and he chased the Seminole Indians into Florida, but then he followed them into Florida. Now, Florida was held by Spain at this time. That was a problem. In the meantime, 2 Englishmen were known to have been assisting the Indians. Jackson was a judge himself. Jackson held a court, a real court with himself as judge. You might say it was not a fair court because he already knew the facts of the case. But anyway, he gave the men a chance to defend themselves. They could not. So he hung them. These were 2 British subjects. This put the United States at odds with both Spain and Great Britain. But eventually the country got off the hook. President Monroe decided not to prosecute Jackson because Jackson was extremely popular. So Monroe left him alone. But a man named Adams with John Quincy had negotiated a treaty. Otis was a Spanish man. And in the treaty, Spain sold Florida to the United States. This got the United States, although Spain said to Adams that we cannot police the area. We just don't have the people living there. We don't have the army. We're busy fighting Napoleon anyway. We can't be, so here, you take it for so many $1 million. Spain needed the money right then, really badly. So Spain sold Florida to the United States. Nobody knew how valuable Florida was. Florida was mostly what looked on as being a swampy wasteland full of rattlesnakes and alligators and whatever else, but a lot of wildlife. Didn't realize how valuable it would become later. In the meantime, the United States had had their eyes on both Texas and Cuba. The United States promised, we will not lay any claim to Texas or to Cuba. Now, folk, I have to say, if this is true, the United States wound up breaking that agreement. Now, in the case of Texas, Texas eventually became part of Mexico after Mexico rebelled against Spain and got their independence. That story is going to be told later. But anyway, Texas, we eventually took over, as you know. As for Cuba, we eventually freed it from Spain, and a lot of that was Spain's own fault. They were treating the Cubans badly. but we fought a war with Spain in 1898, and we took Texas. I mean, we took Cuba, but we never annexed Cuba. The southern people were really upset because they were hoping to make slave states out of both territories. But, again, it did not go their way. The western boundary of the United States was set up, fixed. Essentially, it said that this territory here, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Arizona, Nevada, and California, these territories were to be given to Spain and to remain with Spain. And again, obviously, we broke that part of the treaty later. But then circumstances changed, folks. By the time we took Texas, it was no longer part of Spain, but now part of Mexico. Now, here was the problem, though, that Spain was having. On the one hand, they were over in Europe, they were fighting Napoleon, and in the meantime, spurred on by the success of the United States to break away from Great Britain, Spain's colonies in Latin America began to break away in droves. All right. Now, Brazil, of course, is part of Portugal. Brazil did not fight Portugal, did not break away. So they had ties with Portugal that lasted a long time. But as for Chile, Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, Paraguay, Uruguay, Colombia, Venezuela, these countries along in here, and Central America and Mexico, they all began fighting the Spanish at once. Now, the islands did not take part. For the same reason, the British Isles, you may not know, the British Isles actually sent delegates to the Philadelphia Convention, but they said, here in these islands, we have no place to hide. So Cuba did not take part. Cuba remained with Spain, but the rest of Latin America revolted and successfully revolted. Simon Bolivar and San Martin, if any of you are from Latin America, you might have heard those names. If you studied world history, you might have bumped into those names. But these two men freed Latin America from Spain. And Spain, they sent an army, they tried, but they had to spend most of their time fighting Napoleon. And besides that, the territory was too vast. Spain simply could not hold on to it. And the nations that were rebelling were too many. All right. Well, it was feared, once the Napoleonic Wars were over, it was feared that Spain might team up with France and Prussia, that is basically Germany, to try to recover its lost territories. So President Monroe gave a speech that's come to be known as the Monroe Doctrine. It consists of three main parts. He said nobody in Europe was going to be allowed to colonize the Western Hemisphere anymore. The Western Hemisphere is closed to further colonization. Any attempt by a European country to interfere in the Western Hemisphere would be looked on as an unfriendly act against the United States. And he said the United States would stay out of the internal affairs of Europe, a promise that we kept for the next 80 or so years. Then, thanks to the invention of the airplane, the automobile, the big ocean liner, we began to get more and more involved in the affairs of the world. But for many years, we kept this part of the agreement. Monroe had no power to enforce it, but if you study world history, Great Britain joined the United States at this point and said, we will not stand by. Well, why was Great Britain so concerned with it? Because these Latin American countries, now that they were independent, did not have to give their profits in trade to Spain anymore. That meant they could put their goods on the market cheaper, and that benefited both Latin America and Great Britain. So Great Britain told the rest of Europe, if you send any of your ships across, you'll have to tangle with our Navy, because we're not going to allow you to cross the ocean and fight to get these Spanish territories back. So the Spanish territories in the New World have remained independent to this day. Except for Cuba. Cuba is now independent thanks to a war the United States fought. President Monroe had what you might call a one-party administration, similar to Washington's. No, Monroe was not elected unanimously. One elector said only Washington should be unanimous, so this elector voted for himself. Now, the Supreme Court, like in the last week or two, voted that electors can vote for whomever they want to. And in the 2016 election, a couple of electors said, we don't want to vote for the candidate that we're supposed to, we want to vote for someone else. And they got away with it. But the Electoral College, generally, most of the electors, 99.9% of them have voted for whomever their state told them to vote for whomever the voters told them to vote for. But an elector can vote for whomever he wants. So one of the electors during Monroe's last election said, I'm going to vote for someone else besides Monroe because I don't want Monroe to be unanimous. Now, every Secretary of State since 1800 had been the next president. John Quincy Adams was Secretary of State to James Monroe, so I mean, he had negotiated the Adams-Onis Treaty. John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams, President number 2. So John Quincy Adams felt like he was next in line, always a dangerous place to be. There was Crawford running, Clay running, Calhoun, and Jackson running. Clay put together his American system thinking that he could win with it. The American system had high tariffs to protect home industries. He favored the government spending vast sums of money for roads, and keep that in mind. I'm going to have more to say about that in a few minutes. But the government up until this time had not spent money for roads or canals, but he felt it was time the government did so. And Crawford suffered a stroke that partially paralyzed, partially incapacitated him, but he did not get out of the running. Calhoun was a Southerner from South Carolina. Clay was from Kentucky. Calhoun was from South Carolina, but he believed he could get votes in the populous northern states, and again, any candidate hoped to win had to get votes in the northern states. He favored high tariffs. Now, folk, keep this is going to sound strange in view of what happened. Like Clay, he favored internal improvements. Eventually, though, he was to split over the issue of tariffs. The Southern people said, we don't want a high tariff. Calhoun said he really didn't want them, but he openly favored high tariffs in order to try to get the northern votes. The northern people were becoming industrious, and they wanted to protect their home industries. Now, Clay was to run for president 3 times, and during one of them, I don't remember which campaign, people whispered, Mr. Clay, if you make that speech, you won't get very many votes. Clay said, I would rather be right than president. He never got to be president. He ran 3 times and lost all 3. But most presidents would seem like would rather be president than be right. All right. Jackson, he was an outsider, like the first political outsider. Unlike the other men before his time, all the other presidential candidates and vice presidential candidates had come from the wealthy, come from the elite. Jackson has come from poverty, but he got so much support it surprised the other politicians. Now, for the first time, now we'd had cases before where the popular votes chose some of the electors, but this time popular votes chose most of the electors for the first time. And then remember, in the beginning, when Washington was elected, the electors were chosen with state legislature, but more and more electors started to be chosen by popular vote. Well, with so many men in the race, Calhoun dropped out to seek the vice presidency, which he got. Jackson got the most popular votes, but neither candidate had a majority, and according to the law, according to the Constitution, the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. All right, folk. Because Henry Clay had gotten the least votes, his name was dropped. Now, I want to pause here. If any of you were to come to me and say, Mr. Cunningham, if you will give me a high grade, I'll give you a really high rating on ratemyprofessor.com, I'd have to say, hey, get out of my sight. I make no such deals. But among representatives and senators, folk, it's commonplace for one representative to approach another and say, hey, I know you want this certain bill passed that favors your district, and I want this bill passed that favors mine. I will vote for your bill if you will promise to vote for mine. This is commonplace. I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying this has been going on since the beginning of our democracy. This is how bills get passed a lot of time. It's called log rolling. I'll vote for what you want if you'll vote for what I want. And anyway, Henry Clay threw his support behind John Quincy Adams. In the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams won by 1 vote. Immediately, well, 3 days later, Adams asked Clay to be his Secretary of State, and Jackson became upset. Now, when the vote was taken, Jackson was there in Washington, and he had congratulated Adams on his victory. But then, 3 days later, when Adams asked Clay to be a Secretary of State, he said, corrupt bargain, corrupt bargain. These two men came to a corrupt bargain, and they overthrew the will of the people by a corrupt bargain between them. Now, folk, this is not the last time it happened. It is believed, and I'm not going to call it corrupt, that Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama made an agreement that if Hillary Clinton would support Barack Obama would make her Secretary of State. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. There might be, but this is politics. This is the way our government is run. If any of you think it's wrong, you're welcome to say so. But this is simply the way it's run. If there was such a bargain made, it would not make me think anything less of either Clay or John Quincy Adams. But anyway, Clay became Secretary of State, which meant that it looked like Clay was next in line to be president, because up until this time, every Secretary of State became the next president, but it didn't happen to Clay. Well, Adams had a tough time as president. He tried to choose men based on their abilities rather than their politics. Keep in mind there was only one political party anyway. He offered Crawford a job. Crawford declined. He offered Jackson a job. Jackson declined. My dad was a fan of Franklin Roosevelt, and my dad used to talk about how that Franklin Roosevelt had offered a job to the man he defeated. When Roosevelt defeated Wilkie in 1940, he gave Wilkie a job being ambassador to the Far East, which Wilkie accepted. But today, we just simply, presidents who win don't give jobs to the president who loses, or the man who loses. Nevertheless, Adams was going to pick Jackson. Jackson declined, pick Crawford. Crawford declined. Adams and his men were often at odds with each other. Now, I want to explain to you, folk. The President of the United States has got to be in charge of the executive department. Now, the President cannot fire a judge. The President cannot fire a Supreme Court justice. The President cannot fire a congressman. But he can fire members of his own cabinet, anyone in the executive branch. So if someone in the executive branch does not agree with him, he can fire them. In the case of Richard Nixon, it proved to be disastrous when he fired someone in the executive branch. And Andrew Johnson also fired a man, but both of those men faced impeachment. But the president is supposed to have the right to fire anyone in the executive branch. Well, his cabinet members are often at odds with each other. He would make appointments oftentimes just to placate enemies rather than reward friends. He had great plans for the country. One of them was he planned to build roads. He planned to build canals. Congress would not approve the money. He also planned to build a huge telescope, which would be the biggest telescope in the Western Hemisphere, on one of the mountains near Washington, D.C. Now, if that telescope had actually been built today, with today's lights and automobile headlights and all that stuff, would be utterly worthless. You have to have telescopes far out in the mountains, far away from civilization, away from headlights and away from cities. But anyway, I'm just curious. If any of you ever seen the Milky Way, you can't see it anymore. Not in the civil. You can only see it if you go somewhere far out in the country where there are no lights. When I was a child, I used to look up in the sky and there was the Milky Way. Today I look up in the sky, it's not there. It's still, oops, correction, it's still there. You can't see it for all the earthly lights shining in the sky and blotting out the dimmer lights of the Milky Way. Okay, but it's still there because some people in this world can see it. Go to in the middle of Australia's big desert and you can see it there. Go to the middle of our deserts, you might can see it. Even though I've played a war game in a desert in California one time back in 1983, and we could see 3 lit up areas. One of them was Las Vegas, one of them was San Bernardino, and one of them was Reno. So even our deserts now have a lit up sky. All right. Anyway, he could not get his job done like his father before him. John Quincy Adams only lasted 4 years. All right. With that, folk, we'll move on. But first things first.